we're going to be focusing tonight on the COP27 meeting that took place last November. And Steve Watrous here from Milwaukee attended that conference. And I believe it was his first time to be at a COP conference. But as you know, our longtime member and activist, George Stone, has attended several. And I hope that George is going to get on pretty soon, because we want him to be able to give his evaluation on some of these things also. Now we're going to proceed with our speaker for the night, Steve Watrous, who's going to talk about his experience going to Egypt for the COP27 climate conference, and this past November. And Steve has been a longtime activist in Milwaukee. I remember, I think one of the first big Earth Day anniversaries that we had here in Milwaukee, Steve and I were on the organizing committee with two other people, and we had, oh my gosh, I know there were 4,000 people in the Earth Day parade, and there were about 16,000 people that came to all the workshops, and it was a huge success. And it also turned out to be about 75 degrees that day in April in Milwaukee, which helped enormously. So Steve has a long history of working on these issues, as well as having been a teacher at both UWM and MATC, now retired, correct, Steve?
That's right.
Yes, and so we're really happy to have you share your experiences. Steve Watrous.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks for the nice introduction, Julie, and nice to see you all. Some I've known for a long time, and some I'm meeting for the first time, which is great. So I'd like to show some pictures, and some of you have seen some of these already, but I mixed it up from the last time I showed this. That is to the United Nations Association, where I did a presentation in January. I'm the president of the Milwaukee chapter, and that was who I was representing when I went to COP27, actually the national organization. There were about 4 of us from the UNA USA. And I had some doubts about the whole thing. In fact, I didn't book a plane until fairly late in the game just to see if this thing was going to be worthwhile. And it was to me, and I think it was worthwhile for the environmental movement and, well, for the world as a whole. This COP27, these COP, this is like the 27th, right? It's called Conference of the Parties. Started a little bit more than 27 years ago because it had a lull with COVID. And it's the one place and one time in the world where all the countries, a lot of corporations, a whole lot of lobbyists, and a real lot of environmental activists get together and interact, and sometimes have demonstrations, and sometimes interrupt each other and get angry, and sometimes work on strategies for the future. And so I saw some of all of that. I think some of those things you wouldn't get a sense of if you just followed it in the newspaper, because they cover sort of the headline top level stuff. But to actually be there and see the million things going on, I was actually encouraged. I saw a lot of positive things. I'll try and show you at least some of those. Let me show you a couple of things before I get into the pictures. There were a lot of good ideas there that I'd never heard of before. Maybe you've all heard them all, but some were new to me. So let me show you one that was sort of interesting. It's sort of a potato chip little bag, sort of a contributor to waste when you see them flying down the street in the wind, right? However, this one was made partly out of stone. It's made out of calcium carbonate, and some guy has figured out a way to use much less plastic resin in making these kind of things. And so he made a bunch of them for the COP27 because, well, they were running out of food and needed something to eat, so they needed these potato chips. But it's not that it can be recycled so much easier than the usual bag. It has other ways of being cool. One is using less plastic in the first place, which means less oil. But also, if these can be collected somewhere along the way, they can actually be mixed into cement, because cement is made with calcium carbonate, and so which is a big polluter actually to make cement. And so if you grind these up and put them into a certain level, it doesn't diminish the strength of the cement or concrete. And so you've done a little bit there in a couple ways to save the environment. on more of a critical note, I've got this booklet. They had lots of literature there. I brought back some of it. Could you see this, Hoodwinked in the Hothouse? And it's sort of a critique of just about every kind of technical possible solution to climate change. Maybe you see it has a critique of, well, let's see, of carbon pricing, of nature-based solutions, of bioenergy, of natural gas, of hydrogen, of landfill gas to energy, of waste incineration, and the rest. This was put out by Via Campesina and some other pretty left-oriented groups. So, there was good and there was bad. Let me mention an analogy that some people liked. I liked anyway. At one of the workshops, somebody said, "Well, think of the world in this situation. You've seen when sometimes a bus, like a school bus, goes down a road and a dog goes chasing after it." He says, "Well, the dog is us, the environmental movement, and the bus is the climate crisis and the increasing global warming." And he says, the dog is chasing, and the dog is getting faster and faster, but so is the bus. The bus is also accelerating toward the cliff. And he says that at the current rate, the dog is never going to catch that bus unless that dog does something drastically different. And so that's sort of where we're at, chasing the bus and trying to figure out some way to really have a game changer. So having said that, let me just jump to some photos. This is what I wanted to show you for the start, for sort of the plus and minus. So Michael Mann, maybe you know, a really world-class environmentalist, was here in Milwaukee a year and a half ago for a thing that the UNA was doing. And so he goes to these COPs. And so here's what he had to say. "Don't despair. It's never about a single COP. Yes, this year's summit, like every summit, fell short of what is needed, but the overall trajectory is progress. This is not the time to give up on the world's only functional framework to tackle climate change." I don't know about the only part. There's some other possibilities out there, but just a little bit more on what he has to say. "It happens now late every year at the 2-week international UN-sponsored climate summit known as Conference of the Parties, or COP for short. Prominent figures in the climate movement pronounced the proceedings dead on arrival. For example, Greta Thunberg at the previous one declared it a greenwashing festival and didn't even come to this one. But anyway, to continue reading, "A failure before negotiations have even come to completion. They insist that we've missed our final chance, in quotes, to address the climate change. Such reactions delight polluters and their enablers who thrive on disengagement. And there is no greater path to disengagement than the belief on the part of erstwhile climate advocates that it's too late to do anything." So he thinks it's worthwhile. So COP27 was in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, sort of the far side of the world. Everyone knows where Egypt is, but Sharm el-Sheikh is not in Cairo. It's this little point at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, a resort town that is used to having conferences, although not really to speak. And so here's welcome to COP27. There's the Michael Mann thing I just read, but we'll skip over that for now. So this is in the green zone, as I mentioned, the somewhat lesser security zone. We had a lot of artwork, and here's one called Rising Tide. And you know about that thing about rising tide, raising all boats? Well, here's a sort of play on those words. You can see part of the transition there where the one is kind of sinking into the rising tide. And here's the whole progress from sort of on top of the world, in a sense, getting caught in the rising tide, sort of a metaphor, but actually a reality of rising climate, rising ocean levels, and here sinking into it. Here's one called Heaven and Hell. And this was sort of a kind of a fun thing. You'd go in, they gave you a little questionnaire, you had to fill it out, and then the person in charge would look through your answers. There's some really hard questions about, well, your own lifestyle. And if you didn't get all of them right, you'd be sent to hell, and that is into a room that was supposed to symbolize global scorching, basically. And most people ended up in hell because, well, that's the trajectory that we're on, I'm afraid. Still in the green zone here, there were like hundreds of workshops every day, and it's even hard to keep track of all of them or even find all of them. Some of these buildings were like mazes. But just here a little example. So energy efficiency and conservation, cooperation between Egypt and Japan, risk mitigation for sustainable transportation, elevating the voices of women in agriculture, challenges and solutions for women. Fascinating things, stuff that you wouldn't get if you just read the headlines. So just one shot of Sharm el-Sheikh. It's has these fabulous resorts. This is not where I stayed, but they filled up and then some. And there was, well, frankly, profiteering going on when the owners realized that the supply of lodging was not enough for the demand. Somewhere around 40,000 people came to this thing, according to the UN count, and that's a lot. So I was prepared to see no demonstrations going on. The sort of history of the COP is that, well, they have demonstrations by environmentalists outside the gates, calling on the governments of the world to do more and better. With Egypt, it's something of a repressive dictatorship. As somebody mentioned earlier, it has political prisoners. Well, as I came to register, this is actually my first real taste of the conference, outside the doors to go in to register in the main building were the vegans who were talking about be vegan, make peace. And the rumor that demonstrations would be not allowed was true outside of the grounds, but inside of the grounds for the conference, the UN was in charge of security. And so this is just like a couple steps inside. And so, well, they had a demonstration and it was allowed. And well, that was encouraging to me right there. The blue zone where that was the gate to, that was the most restricted zone, and then the green one, which was a step down. This is still another step down. This is sort of the anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist group that had another space away from the main venues, where in this particular case, they had a nice Egyptian dinner for us and a nice presentation, pretty radical. And then, well, they had a party. You can see people dancing in the strobe lights here. So it wasn't all people in suits and ties, thank goodness. This is back inside the blue zone, just inside the gate where I just showed you. And you can't quite see the sign. I wasn't tall enough, but it says, "Don't gas Africa." And so you might say, what does that mean? Well, let me say a few things about Africa. The thing was held in Africa for one thing, right? And so I wanted to make sure to touch on that a bit. And various speakers and various workshops touched on Africa, which was logical because that's where we were. So here, Africa is projected to have 3 billion people in the coming years and actually surpass China and India for population. That is the whole continent of Egypt. However, it produces just 3% of the greenhouse gases, and but is suffering a lot from the climate change that's going on because, well, poor people usually take it on the chin for these things. So only 3% of the greenhouse gases. Some see an opportunity in this. It's the least industrialized of the continents, and in a sense behind on development as we think of it, and but are wanting to develop a higher standard of living. But how to do it? And so the idea is, given that they're starting at a lower point than say the US or Asia, for example, they do have an opportunity to do it in a green way. And so this was stressed a couple of times by various people. And they're working on it. I mean, there are actually projects that are starting there and they're trying to spread it in various possible ways. And so that actually I found kind of encouraging. Some more on Africa. So one expert was talking about things, Senegal, you know, a small country in Western Africa. They made a decision at the governmental level to export natural gas, which they have some of. Here's the thing. Europe, because of the Ukraine war, is desperate for natural gas. They don't have enough because that pipeline was, well, it was actually, it turns out the pipeline from Russia to Europe was blown up by the US. And so where to get natural gas? Well, Senegal has some, and they're being pressured by Egypt and by Europe to well, package it up and send it off to Europe. The person in charge thought this was backsliding, that actually this Ukraine war was setting back the environmental movement in various ways. Stated that we've lost years of progress because of this Ukraine war. More on that later. Moving to Congo, the Congo is now being incentivized to look for more oil for drilling, once again, because Europe is wanting that. And so they did do some solar. They have some good projects going on. In the Congo, Jimmy Carter was there. But there's some problems, not just because of the Ukraine war, but other things too. And well, let's move on. This is the layout of the blue zone, and this is the most secure area, and that combined with the green zone, which was across the street from it, it was about the size of the state fairgrounds that we have here, you know, over in West Dallas. And lots of countries, lots of corporations, lots of NGOs, or now they say CSO, civil society organization, had booths there. And a lot of them had like little stages where they had presentations. So maybe you know, John Kerry was the head of the US delegation to this thing. And so he and a whole bunch of other people were there. And they would come out to the parts of the blue zone that you know, all of us with passes could come to. And so here he was giving a presentation. And just a few words on what he had to say. This first one, starting about financing things. And his presentation was just after President Biden had come to COP27, given a speech. And of course, Kerry was very positive on the things that were in the speech. And there were a bunch of good things mentioned in the speech. If you read through Biden's speech, the US is doing some good things, also doing some bad things. Kerry did not say so much about that. But he talked about the wonders of USAID, about various programs they had, how they're going to leverage money to get more things out of it, how they're going to help countries meet their NDCs, that is nationally declared contributions to solving the climate crisis. He also spoke at a different venue later in the day about ocean issues. And there are a couple of good ideas I got out of that I hadn't heard before. You know, these cargo ships that have containers on top of containers, shipping stuff around the world. Well, they burn like the worst possible fuel. It's called bunker, the most polluting kind of oil. However, Maersk, which maybe you know is one of the major shipping companies of the world, has committed to having 8 ships built that would be zero polluting. And Kerry mentioned that there were 19 other such ships that were now in the works. And that would be, well, that would be a major contribution to less pollution coming from ships sailing around the oceans. And here he is a little closer up. This is not my photo. This is stolen from somebody else. These were the parts that we couldn't get into. This is where the COPs, that is the Conference of the parties being countries of the world, meet to work on declarations and declaring their contributions to solving the climate crisis and such. They did have a final document. People said it was sort of went easy on the fossil fuel industry. And as many people remarked, there were over 600 fossil fuel lobbyists attending this COP27, and it did seem that they kind of got their way. But like with Michael Mann, he says the trajectory is a positive way, and that things in his opinion were positive enough to support this thing. So here, in case you're interested, you can see who was there, the top level people from the US delegation. Some of you probably heard of Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, Jennifer Granholm, Secretary of Energy, Samantha Power, who's the head now of USAID, the Agency for International Development, Michael Reagan, who's the administrator of the US Environmental Protection Agency, the guy who's in charge of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. Also Jake Sullivan, he's on the TV news a lot, National Security Advisor, Tom Vilsack, the Secretary of Agriculture. Pretty high level. I mean, it looked like they were taking it seriously. And I'm not going to read all of President Biden's speech, but he did say some things, and even had a program that he had worked out with Egypt. And I'll just read that little paragraph there if I can get the pictures of you all out of the way. So, and Biden says, and I'm pleased to announce today, alongside the European Union and Germany, a $500 million package to finance and facilitate Egypt's transition to clean energy. This package will enable Egypt to deploy 10 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030, while bringing offline 5 gigawatts of inefficient gas-powered facilities, which would therefore, of course, reduce emissions in Egypt and the power sector by 10%, according to President Biden. Another thing you probably wouldn't get out of watching the coverage of this thing in the newspapers is that it was actually a working session for environmental activists. And so I went with another guy from our national organization, the UNA USA, and he was especially interested in indigenous peoples things. And so we went to some of their stuff, and here you can see maybe at the top it says COP27 Indigenous Peoples Caucus, the rolling agenda. And some of the things on it were their strategy meeting, working on some text for a document they were preparing. Loss and damage, you can see maybe there's a paragraph of it there. That was the main positive thing people thought came out of this, relatively concrete positive thing to come out of this COP27. As someone mentioned earlier on this very Zoom that they have not funded it yet. And so they've bumped that over to the next COP, which will be in December in the United Arab Emirates. But people were there working on strategy at the grassroots, and I found that encouraging. There's another encouraging thing. This is the Climate Justice Pavilion, and lots of good presentations were going on there during the course of this almost 2 weeks of conference. And here you can see maybe these are people from the NAACP from the US. They have observer status at this thing. And so they were giving a presentation in this Climate Justice Pavilion. And they announced what they said was a breakthrough. They'd been working with Jackson, Mississippi, which has had terrible water problems, maybe you know. And so they had actually launched a suit against the state of Mississippi and managed to get the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to agree with them. And the EPA said they would open a civil rights complaint against the state of Mississippi over the terrible water problems in Jackson. So people applauded that. They thought there was a breakthrough. Indigenous women were there. They didn't mince any words about how awful they thought the non-Indigenous peoples of the world were treating them. And so here were people from various countries, Latin America and such, gave a really rousing talk. Here was another one about leading the charge, women in the climate crisis. And I went to a couple things at the Ukraine booth, and I've maybe some of you know I've been working on that issue a bit with the End the Wars Coalition. In fact, we have an event coming up on the anniversary of the Ukraine War, which is the 24th. We'll be doing an event at the St. Francis Church at 4th and Brown at 2 in the afternoon on a Friday with various speakers calling for peace in Ukraine and for the U.S. to stop escalating it with additions of more and more complicated weapons. And so let me say a little more about Ukraine while we're on that one. So they actually had high-level people there. They had the Minister of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources was there from Ukraine. And so, you know, things are awful in a lot of ways in Ukraine, but here's some of the details, some of which I wouldn't even have imagined, but that you might find interesting. There's a lot of damage to the environment from military actions. And so, let's see. So in their opinion, this invasion, they call it, by Russia challenges the rule of law and peaceful coexistence. It does damage to their cultural heritage. And they said that half of the world's imported food comes from Ukraine. Some of that's getting out, as you know, thanks to negotiations with Russia in the Black Sea, but not enough. And more on that later if we have time. The wetlands are being destroyed. For one thing, tanks are driving through them as they go back and forth in the shifting battle lines. And according to the speakers, the environmental damage, the pollution will be there for generations to come. So the United Nations Development Program is there in Ukraine. The US, a lot of us are disappointed the United Nations was not able to prevent this war. They did try, it didn't work out. Nevertheless, they're there and actually had a fancy booklet. And so the person from the UNDP, that is the development program, was there talking about it a bit. She said that the environment is always a victim of war. And they have done assessments even during the midst of the war and actually have some environmental programs going on actually during the war, which was amazing to me. Some problems that they noted: the chemical and pesticide industry in Ukraine has been bombed. And so all those terrible chemicals are now loose in the environment. once they're loose, they're much harder to get back than if they were still in their factory and being used for something. The waste management system has gone to hell in various parts of the country. And so people's garbage goes to the streets, goes to the back alleys, goes to the rivers. Once again, once the stuff's in the river, it's much harder to clean up. There's unexploded ordnance all over the place. And so that's a problem they're going to have to face even when the war is over, which we hope will be soon. There's been destruction in the urban areas, in particular the infrastructure, which means, for example, that the water and sewer systems have been wrecked. And so people not only can't get water very well, but whatever water they do turn into waste doesn't go to proper treatment. Agriculture is disrupted. And so they have landmines. They claim that they're the most landmined country in the world at this point. And some of those are right in the farmers' fields, which means that during the war and even after, they're going to have trouble producing the food that they need. Meanwhile, other places, for example, Kenya is really suffering from the shipments of grain that they used to get and aren't coming. But on top of another problem related to this conference, that is, they have a drought in Eastern Africa, the Horn of Africa, that's causing them to need more food from outside. As I mentioned, their natural heritage is also being wrecked by this war. They declared that there were 33 million tons of carbon dioxide were produced by Ukraine in the year 2021. But last year, that is when the war got going, they estimate that it'll be 3 times as much. That is a huge increase in carbon dioxide being produced. Part of the problem is fires, forest fires that have been started up by the war, and the blowing up of oil depots, for example, and pipelines. And of course, the ultimate threat to the environment is nuclear war, which is why we need to get this Ukraine thing under control as soon as possible. They talked about Chernobyl, which you know. They said that the Russians had occupied it for 35 days, and that by being there and having tanks and artillery, they had stirred up the ground. And so pollution that had been sort of settled down had been stirred up and was now loose in the atmosphere. So still one more environmental thing that I hadn't thought of beforehand. The Russians have also occupied that area that has the 6 reactors, the biggest nuclear energy complex in Europe. It's been shut down now for production, but it's they've been shooting back and forth from it and toward it. It raises serious worries. They said 1/3 of the country had problems from landmines. It can take them years to clear. They actually had a figure, 799, 795 explosive devices. So in other words, about 800,000 explosive devices that were loose in the country. They had talked about an emerald preserve, about their forests and wildlife, and that was being destroyed in the war. And according to the person speaking, they had 600 animal species that lived around this emerald preserve and under a protected situation, and that they were under threat because of the reserve being wrecked. Underwater management, they said 500 facilities have been damaged in the war so far. Actually, this was in November, actually early November, before the really heavy Russian shelling of the infrastructure got going. And well, that's enough Ukraine for now. Let's move on. Here's I took a couple of pictures of some of their slides of their PowerPoint. So the direct damage they estimated at that point was 97 billion US. And it mentions here safe reconstruction of buildings and infrastructure to modern and green standards. That's what they want to do. And of course, support recovery of services. To do it right, to build back better, to build back green, they say the need for reconstruction and recovery, $349 billion US. I don't know where that's going to come from. And every day of war, they need more and more to recover from. It's a very sad situation. This was a second workshop they had, talking more about the sort of worldwide consequences of the war in Ukraine. And so they had a couple of folks from Africa. can see them there. The woman here was from Ukraine. This woman was from Latin America, talking about the wide-ranging consequences of that war and how it was wrecking the environment and living standards in their own countries. So moving on, there are a lot of good ideas I found at this thing and stuff I hadn't thought of before. Some, make perfect sense when you hear about them. So here's, for example, a program that was being done in Brazil, and it says Smart School Food Solutions. And so they had some global data here that 700 million kids are affected by hunger, 150 million are considered malnourished. 1/3 of food is lost or wasted. And that wasted food causes about 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So something to work on, and they are working on it and would like to work on it broader. If only they had more support and money, some of these ideas are scalable. That is, it could be spread around and made bigger. While we're on school stuff, consider school buses, not just the one the dog was chasing. They could be made electric. That would be a good thing. But what about in summer when you don't use them much and they're kind of sitting around? Well, how about this? In summer, more electricity is needed because of air conditioning, right? And so you need solar panels and other things that would create energy. But how to store it properly for that rainy day or cloudy night? School buses that are electric can be turned into storage batteries. I hadn't thought of that. It was exciting. It was interesting. And speaking of buses, they talked about how the system that we're used to with buses running set routes at set more or less set times. And they said, well, just a lot of people don't care for that kind of bus system. What if they had an arrangement, sort of like these little transit vans that you see, but if you could, have the bus system come with a small bus that is a van to your door and pick you up and take you to exactly where you were going, wouldn't a lot more people do that instead of having to rely on cars? Sounded good to me. This is one I mentioned in the previous talk, so some of you have seen this. They had venture capitalists there. I've gone to a lot of conferences of various sorts in my life, and I don't think I've ever been to one where there were venture capitalists. And it was actually interesting. And these are folks that have access to lots of money, and at least the ones that were here were interested in, operations that would make a profit, but also do some good for the environment. Pros and cons to that. But it was interesting to hear some of their stuff. So here's some of the things they talked about the food waste, about the greenhouse gases costs that were created in the food process, especially with meat. And so quite a few of them talked about how they wanted to invest in alternative protein opportunities. And another one talked about plastics. And in addition to that one I showed you earlier that was partly made out of calcium carbonate, they have found a way to use plant material to create some plastics, and that they can produce plastics that would have 80% less carbon dioxide if they were produced in this way, using plant things instead of non-renewable resources. There was discussion of green hydrogen, green in the sense of if you have photovoltaic cells and create you can create hydrogen from that by basically cooking water into its separate parts. And if you do it right, it's not polluting, and there's some prospects for that into the future. I talked about concrete or cement earlier, big emitters, and especially, back to Ukraine, they said, we've got all these bombed out buildings, we've got a lot of cement. We're going to try and get rid of it environmentally good as possible and rebuild as environmentally good as they can. Well, here's one idea. One of the people at this venture capital thing said that there was a process that you could use bacteria to ferment some of the materials used in making cement, and that would help actually diminish the amount of carbon dioxide that was created. Of carbon dioxide that get released in the atmosphere, about 8% of it comes from the process of making cement, which we use a lot of. These all had notes of caution to them. They're doing these things. They have hope, but they it's cautious optimism, as one said. And one of them in this presentation said, we are now trying to make ourselves extinct. And that's, commenting on the present course of things. So one more thing from the venture capitalists. The MC who's speaking there, second from the left, said, well, suppose you had another extra 100 million to invest. What would be your priorities? And so they're actually having to rank these things. And I thought it was interesting. So the first person said, well, alternatives to protein. They wanted to put the money into building infrastructure for fermenting the alternatives to meat protein. Another one said they'd put 70 million of it into more sustainable cities and tackle the cement concrete problem, go big time on solar, and put the rest of it into biodiversity and the agricultural sector. Another one was going to spend all of it on dealing with food waste. Another one is going to decarbonize the grid, a smart grid, and using it to help supply, well, vehicle fleets that were electric, and also talked about alternative fuels for aviation and ships and more renewable energy of all sorts. Another person said, well, he was going to put a basket of things together, 20 million for education of young people to grasp this climate crisis that we're in and what to do about it. Another 20 million for infrastructure, such as the green grid. Another 20 million for policy that is lobbying to constrain the corporations. So a more political aspect to this particular approach. Another 20 million for adaptation, another 20 million for venture funds that would look for breakthrough technologies. Now, there are criticisms of technologies and technological solutions all during this conference. Nevertheless, it's there, it's being done, could be done better. And so anyway, enough from the venture capitalists. I took a picture just in the same room. This is looking sort of sideways from that same stage and see the diversity of people. This is in the green zone where they had basically glorified circus tents. A lot of these were temporary structures put together to put on this really large conference. And maybe you can see these boxes in the background with kind of gray tops. These are like industrial strength air conditioners going full blast all day, and I think all night to keep it cool, so it starts out cool in the morning. It's really hot there. Egypt's a desert, and even in November it's hot. Not as hot as in July. That's why it wasn't held then. They moved it to November, and this one in the Emirates, another hot place, will be in December, which increases the odds of it not being so hot. So we hear presentations of various sorts. These were folks that were from the Pacific Islands who were in some of the most dangerous positions in terms of, well, the ocean rising. And this one was from Kiribati, and made the case that they really need some outside help and some, well, loss and damage operations. And actually many of these, this is like a map of the various island nations of the South Pacific. So Kiribati's right here in the middle. Hawaii's up by this light in the upper corner. But we have French Polynesia, we have New Caledonia, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and so on. They're really nervous, and they came to this in large numbers and said some dressed in traditional outfits with headdresses and things. It was nice to see. So I ran across a booth from Microsoft, and they were giving a presentation. So I sat down to see what it was all about. And Microsoft, between them and Bill Gates in particular, have lots of money that they put into these sort of things. And I came midway through, and they were talking about coal-fired power plants. And I thought maybe I'd come to the wrong place. I mean, come on, this is supposed to be dealing with climate change. But their angle on it was, there are 2,400 coal-fired power plants. They're not going away tomorrow. Are there some ways that we can make them less polluting in the meantime while we have a transition to more renewable energy? Well, it's one more bite out of the apple, so to speak. And so it seemed worth somebody doing it. There are lots of other booths. Here's one, nuclear for climate. And well, lots of pros and cons to that one, right? Behind it was sustaining all life, which is from the co-counseling community, or re-education co-counseling, re-evaluation counseling, sorry. lots of booths there from civil society organizations. The UN was there in lots of ways. I mean, the thing was put on by the UN, and many of their people from their many arms were there. And so here's one that was dealing with another, well, climate problem, that is horrible flooding that was taking place in Pakistan around that time. And so they've got things that the UN had done to help out in Pakistan. A civil society group that you know, or maybe even be a member of, that is the Rotary, is quite active worldwide. And I've actually seen stuff that they've been doing in Central America that was quite positive on the environmental front. And so they had a presentation about some of their projects around the world, including big time in Egypt. They'd actually found an aquifer somewhere out in the desert and drilled down to it and, well, created a new oasis that was able to produce food, which they need in Egypt because they don't really have that much, fertile land that's irrigated enough to produce food. So here's a little bit more from the Rotary. And just a little more of sort of the sense of what you get walking around. So this, I think this was from Brazil, and they had, no, Nigeria, I'm sorry, Nigeria. And so they had displays right out in the pathway where people were walking around in this maze of booths and things. When President Biden came down, he brought a whole bunch of Congress people with him, none of them from Wisconsin. But I met some of them when they were at an evening event after President Biden had spoken, and got to chat a little bit with them. And there was one big-time assistant to Pete Buttigieg there, that is the transportation secretary. Had a good chat with her at the dinner that was kind of following the presentations. The point of this whole thing is to save the Earth from, well, terrible climate change, and in particular, terrible gas emissions that were leading to that. This is something put on by NASA, where they had the different kinds of pollution: carbon dioxide, sulfate, dust, sea salt, nitrates. And this is actually a moving picture of where they kind of, and it was on a loop, and it would show where these things would sort of spring up and then spread around the world. It was mesmerizing and scary all at the same time. The World Health Organization was there, and had this sort of kind of artsy thing on their pavilion. And just to wrap up with a few more things here, this is back at the Green Zone in the evening, and lots more artsy things over there. And one was this big panda made entirely of recycled stuff and powered by renewable energy at night. And I think I'll wrap up with this one. This is just a scene from it's near the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion, where I spent a fair amount of time, and you can see people with wonderful headdresses and things. A lot of folks, especially men, in dark suits and ties and white shirts and shiny shoes and stuff. And I took all that stuff along, but after a while I realized that the dress code was not all that strict. So, my roommate basically from the UNA USA was from Hawaii, and that's one reason he's especially interested in island things and indigenous things. And he brought me a present of a genuine Hawaiian shirt. And so our last day there, we both wore Hawaiian shirts, and just had a fun time not dressing up for this whole show. So I think I'm going to stop the share here. And well, actually, I'm close to 40 minutes here. So why don't I just stop on further presenting, and hope that you have some questions and disagreements and etc. So thank you all for your kind attention.
A lot of slides showed technical solutions, technology solutions. You did have the venture capitalists. So a lot of people there who are looking for ways to make money from the transition to renewables. Did you notice any stratification among people from, were people from poor countries, from island nations, maybe I should say derogatory about this whole idea that we got a bunch of capitalists here, they're trying to make money off from reducing their carbon consumption, and really aren't directly addressing the problem?
Yes. I wasn't sure how that would be handled. In particular, I was thinking the blue zone where you had to have the highest credentials to get into would be more sort of middle of the road on these things. But actually, no. That one that I showed you from the woman from Kiribati with the headdress, they're quite strong on many things. Here I've got a quote from one of the people on this is actually the last presentation I was at COP before I left with my buddy to go back to Cairo and see some of the wonders of ancient Egypt. Someone said in a strong voice, "This is the 27th failed opportunity to solve the climate crisis." And they're right, it's not been solved. On the other hand, we've had many peace conferences over the years, and peace is not reigning over Earth either. And so it's a matter of doing the best we can. We need to do some lifestyle changes. That book I showed you, debunking every technological thing, including nuclear power, renewable energy, hydroelectricity, geoengineering, carbon capture. Their thing is more kind of people oriented. And the one thing they liked was how Mondragon, the place in Spain that's mostly co-ops, is organized and people-oriented things. Someone asked me, did they deal with the question of the ever-increasing population and the strain that puts on the Earth's carrying capacity? And no, I didn't hear very much of that. That's not to say it didn't happen somewhere, but I didn't hear much of that. As a less technological, more people oriented thing. So does that answer your question? Yeah, well, I guess one more stratification thing was that the top security was for like John Kerry and the government types, that is the parties that were there. And I think early on it was like just the parties, but over time it's like grown and outside people come and, like in Paris or the previous one, which was in Glasgow, would have big demonstrations outside the gates. I thought there might be no demonstrations, which I kind of like at this one, but they were there. I showed two of them, but there were others. Bill McKibben was there and was involved in one of the demonstrations. And so, and mostly people didn't get kicked out for having that as long as they were civil about it. And so there was sort of, it was acceptable to protest. It was understandable, and that's sometimes what people need to do. But anyway, so the green zone was less security, and then that other one I showed that was having the dance party at the time I took that picture was, like I said, really anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist. So the stratification of viewpoints, although there were a mix everywhere. There were people from less developed countries, and they often had booths and found ways to give presentations. For example, at that Climate Justice Pavilion, and so everyone had their say.
Good. Thank you. George Stone, you're next on the stack.
Yes, I really responded negatively to the comment that this is 27 failures. That's absolute nonsense. It reminded me of Churchill's description of democracy. It's a terrible system and extremely messy, but it's better than all the others. We may not be satisfied with the progress at the COP meetings, but they're making progress inch by inch, and it's better than doing nothing. So it's easy to criticize and say that it's a waste of time, but that's absolute nonsense. I go with Michael Mann, who's one of the eminent scientists, climate scientists, who first uncovered much of the evidence to show what's been happening. And he thinks that it's worthwhile. I mean, some effort, of course, is worthwhile. So let's be more positive.
No, I agree with Michael Mann. I just put that in because some of the rest of the critics had their say.
Yeah.
Thank you. Charlie.
Good presentation, Steve. I really enjoyed it, and it's really nice to see those kinds of images. We don't see those on the normal news coverage. But what I'm wondering is, what do you mean by people that are more highly credentialed than others? And all those folks that are, out there doing the protesting, it must cost a bunch of money to go to these things and haul all that equipment there and set it all up. And do they feel like they can be effective, or are they just frustrated that they don't really seem to have an impact on what's going on, that they're not at the table, at the room where it happens, so to speak.
Yes, very good question. So it costs a bunch of money to go there and stay there, and poor people had to have, you know, some kind of government or subsidies to be able to do that. I was afraid that might not happen much, but there were a lot of people from Africa, for example, and those islands, and Latin America had a very strong representation. Is it worth all your while to try and go to COP28? I'd say no. You have to really believe in it and have some spare change. And here's the thing with credentials for the blue zone, and George can maybe confirm if this is true in every COP. I'm not sure if they have the same color scheme, but like I said, the very top level is the government negotiators, you know, which I could never have gotten into. But the next one was the blue zone, which is a pretty large complex, and most of the shots I had were from there. I actually couldn't get in till the second week because I had to glom onto some other group who had a spare badge, but only in the second week. And so for the first week, I did things at the green zone, or that other one that had the radicals, or there were quite a few things off site that didn't need quite as strong credentials. Here's the thing: when I became aware that you had to have these strong credentials to get into the blue zone, it turns out that my group, the United Nations Association at the national level, had neglected to put in for observer status, and you have to do it like a year and a half before a COP. And I guess nobody had raised the issue. And so by the time I started asking them just after the Glasgow COP, which was last fall, well, a year ago fall, it was too late. So what I got from my Hawaiian friend who's been to a lot of these things, he says, you have to start asking around to groups you have any slight connection with to see if they have a spare badge. Well, all right. So I remember the Sierra Club, I called them. They only had 3 badges for the whole country. I called the AFL-CIO, likewise, not many badges for a lot of people that wanted to go. And so thanks to my Hawaiian buddy, like I said, I glommed on to one from another group and was able to get in. But it's I mean, for all the people who were in that maze of buildings, there's like 3,000 observer groups, but then some universities have stuff. Governments can bring a lot of people. And so that sort of fills out the blue zone. George, you want to add anything to that on credentials, or if it's like that in other COPs?
No, only, Steve, that there are other ancillary conferences or meetings, and that's how I got in. I had credentials, and say I'm on the board of directors of Wisconsin Clean Cities, which helped a lot, and I used that credential to get access to one of the ancillary conferences. And so, but there are a number of different ways, but much advanced planning is strongly recommended.
Yeah, I thought maybe, like I said, quite a few universities are on the accredited observer list that can get those badges, although not very many. And I thought, well, you know, I'm graduated from both UWM and Madison. So I thought, well, maybe they're sending people who might have extra badges. Actually, neither of them was registered for observer. Either they didn't get around to it, or I don't know what. So it's that was another reason that I was late in booking my plane flight. But finally, things started falling into place that I could get the credentials, and so then it was worth taking the plunge for the money.
Well, you can always try the old line from the movies. We don't need no stinking badges.
Hi, Sierra.
But do the protesters and the folks who can't get into these main meetings, do they feel like it's worth their while to be there and join in the protests? And maybe, I guess there's value in just meeting other people and making connections, right? And sharing your own anxieties about the situation.
I mean, that for me, that's one of the fun parts. I mean, these workshops are great. The strategy is great, but I met people from all over the world. Got to know some of the people at the Ukraine booth, for example. The Quakers have a presence at the United Nations, and one of their people was there that I had a contact with, so I had a nice discussion with her under a tree. And so if you go there with no preparation whatsoever, there's still some things you could go to, but it wouldn't be worth the money. But some of the things were easy to get credentials for. So there was one that was called the Investment COP, And so some groups were doing this, but it was off of the main complex. It was one of the resort hotels that had conference facilities. And in that one, you know, you'd fill out a form online and send it in, and boom, I had credentials to get into that. And so that was 2 full days of conference with meals, I might say. And so that would, you know, be something that you could do without very much clout.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Jan, you're up next.
Thank you, Steve. Very good presentation. You said you spent a lot of time with the indigenous people, and I'm always impressed with the fact that they are known to be good stewards of the earth. So what was their main focus? Do they have solutions or concerns?
Well, for example, the people in those island nations, and I showed a little map of that, some have really had to, well, find other places to live. So there was talk about mitigation and adaptation and such. And this sort of relates to the loss and damages program that they put into effect, but without funding. That's supposed to come up at the next one. And so some have actually had to like find a way, like even buying land on an island that was well higher up above the ocean to move to, so as to continue having their people being together. And so my buddy from Hawaii said, I think it was, which one was it? I have to look back in the notes, but people from one island nation had bought land in another island nation, which was, you know, friendly to them and had some spare space. And they're actually, they were able to set up farms and support themselves and continue on with their traditional ways of life. So that was kind of encouraging. It's, I don't know that that can solve all the problems of the rise of the ocean, but that was one thing. There are people from the Amazon that had headdresses also. And so interior parts of the Amazon are having terrible problems, especially under the previous president of Brazil, who was saying, you know, gold mining, forestry, burning down everything so as to grow more soybeans or whatever. They were having terrible problems, indigenous people, of which are a lot in the Amazon area, who would like to have their traditional way of life, which was way more in tune with nature and way less producing of greenhouse gases than the rest of us. They were there. Significant numbers, I don't know how many, but they were there and had booths and were able to speak and such, and we're doing some good things. I mean, there's a lot of ideas out there, and some are yet to be done, but really a lot of things are being done, including by our own government, that are noteworthy. Just not enough to catch that school bus running toward the cliff of climate catastrophe.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Julie, you're up next.
Yeah, Steve, thanks a lot. Appreciate it. One thing that's always troubled me about these conferences is the fact that they allow in these fossil fuel lobbyists. And I just think, well, you know, aren't there some rules of the game here of who can attend? You know, do you have to be actually in favor of stopping climate change and stopping fossil fuel use, you know? And so I just was wondering, what kind of an impact do they have if they had over 600 lobbyists this year at this conference? It's the most they've ever had. And every year it's more and more, it seems. And do these fossil fuel lobbyists actually get inside some of the more significant meetings where they have some serious impact on the outcome of the resolutions and things in order to water things down for their benefit?
Well, George would know better than I how far they can get into the inner sanctums, but they're like these working groups during the course of this 2-week thing. This is the longest conference I've ever been at, I have to say. I wasn't there the entire 2 weeks, I have to admit. But you know, the companies are there. Fossil fuel companies are there and have booths and doing presentations and talking to people. And I think they exercise their pressure either through the working groups or buttonholing the officials before or during the conference. But maybe George knows better how they most exert their pressure.
They mostly exert their pressure with, as we used to say, with the checkbook. Now it would be all digital, you know.
Mhm. But
Big money transfers.
why would the United Nations allow them to even attend this UN conference?
My impression
They
is
allow
that
Russia to invade Ukraine.
Well, not quite the same, but you know, the United Nations is a big tent, and any country that wants to join basically can join the United Nations, and so they can all be part of the bargaining. And I think it's the same with corporations. If they put up the money for a booth, I think they can do it. I mean, the countries have to sign on. It's called the United Nations Framework on Framework Convention on Climate Change, the FCCC. So the countries have to sign on to that, but the only thing that they're really signing on to is to participate in the process. I'm not sure the companies even have to sign on to that.
Mhm.
And so, so they, well, they let them in. I don't know if any are excluded. If they go through the proper procedures, I'm not sure if there is any criteria for excluding anybody. I just don't know.
Hmm. And then I also was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the workings of the loss and damage resolution that finally was passed on the very last day, I believe, that countries in the northern hemisphere, as I understand it, wealthier countries would be required to give enough money to assist the countries that are most affected by climate change. With
So
their,
this COP conference was actually extended beyond its scheduled ending date
yes.
because of the work on this loss and damage thing. And the well, the poorer countries of the world were really wanting it to get going, and today, not next COP. And the U.S. was kind of resisting that. And you know, because I'd sort of gotten onto their listserv, I was getting things during the conference, but even after. And so in January, when I was, you know, back in the U.S., I attended one of their Zooms where they had a sort of report back from some of the people. They described how they had actually wanted to go slow on the loss and damage thing. They thought that there should be more preparation work and more research as to what would be the most appropriate things to do that would come to fruition at the following COP, that is coming December. But the other folks overwhelmed that, and it took a while and some arm twisting. But I can't say that they won, but they made it. They're in a good trajectory that they might get something out of it.
Yay.
Tim,
Thanks a lot, Steve. We haven't met, but I sure appreciated your report. I like to kind of humanize these conferences by hearing a personal report. I guess my question is about the United Nations, and you're big on that, involved in that. Anthony Gutierrez, the Secretary General, has been making some pretty radical statements. And I wonder, in fact, I think he's going to have an alternate conference coming up. And he says, any countries can come, but don't come if you're not going to, you know, put up. Just stay home unless you're going to be serious about that. So what is that all about?
You know, he's been really strong. I mean, he talks about how, among other things, that we're sleepwalking into disaster on the climate, and that people are sitting around and not doing enough. And so he's got a big soapbox, and more power to him for saying that. And maybe it helps get people going. You know, as was mentioned at the very start by somebody else during the Zoom, that there is motion, and more people are paying attention to it. Not enough people, not enough motion. But it seems to me he's trying hard. How effective he is, I guess, is yet to be determined. But you know, sometimes you know, I go to these Zooms where people talk about the UN, and sometimes it's shortcomings, and sometimes people say, well, you know, to not be held back by the permanent five on the Security Council, that sort of thing. We need a coalition of the willing. And you've heard that before, and maybe not such good circumstances, but the concept is there that if the UN is sort of hamstrung by its bureaucracy or procedures, that people who really want to do something can get together and try and do it, just as well we're getting together here tonight. And so that's, I mean, there's a lot of processes going on, a lot of moving parts in this battle for saving the climate. The UN is only one of them, really. This conference is a big production, and maybe the biggest that goes on related to this, but it's not the only one. Maybe you saw there was a biodiversity conference that they also called COP that was held in Canada since the one in Egypt. focusing on well, species that were going out of existence and such. So there are other venues, and some of them I think are not so lobbied up by the fossil fuel industry.
Okay, George Stone, we'll give you the last word. It's about 20, almost 25 after, so.
Oh, I want a last word too, if I could.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. Let's put it this way. We'll give George Stone the last question.
Well, I have a comment rather than a question. I want to congratulate Steve on an excellent presentation, and he acquainted us with many different aspects of the COP27 conference, and great job, Steve. And I would like to say that my take-home message is that the need for action to ameliorate the climate crisis is urgent. The scientists consider it much more urgent than the general public does. I leave you with that message.
Yeah, very good. I mean, thank goodness for groups like 350.org and the Sierra Club. And, you know, like I said, the NAACP was there, the AFL-CIO was there. All these groups are at least hip to the situation and all are doing some things in their own way. I guess just a brief last word is I have a story in the current Shepherd about COP27. If anybody, you'll see some of the same stuff, but some different. I used to write a lot for the Shepherd, but then they sort of changed their business model and stuff like 20 years ago. But they asked if I'd write that story, and I guess they liked it enough that they said, well, how'd you like to do something on, well, greenhouse gases in Milwaukee and Wisconsin, and the situation with CO2 and the problems, who's doing things about it. So if you know anybody who's either an expert on Wisconsin greenhouse gases or is doing interesting things about it, I'm all ears.
All right, well, thank you so much. Is there any other final announcement?
All I want to say, what did you bring back for as a souvenir, Steve, for yourself? That was really, really nice from Egypt.
Well, since you asked, I'll show you one that's nearby. Hold on. Suppose you're meaning something different than all the booklets. I don't know if we can see this. This is supposedly real papyrus and some of the ancient gods of Egypt. And I got an earful of them and saw some of the places where they lived and died when I broke off halfway through my 3 weeks in Egypt and went over to the Nile to join a tour that went to some of the wonderful sites of Egypt. And by the way, we did see the Aswan High Dam, which has Lake Nasser behind it. This is down to the southern edge of Egypt. And they're using some of that water to, well, make the desert bloom, using it for irrigation. And they really need fertile land. And apparently you just add water and that's about enough to get things growing. That was impressive right there.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And let's hope that this trajectory of these COP meetings does really move in the right direction, and that we can see some serious changes that can save life as we know it on this planet. So good night, everybody.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Steve.
Thanks very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.